Her Fearless Run, Katherine Switzer's Historic Boston Marathon. Written by Kim Chaffee, illustrated by Ellen Rooney. Pat, pat, pat. The summer sun beat down on 12-year-old Katherine. She held out her piece of chalk and marked the tree as she ran past again. 2 laps to go. Katherine dripped with sweat. Her legs felt like noodles, but she kept running. 1 lap to go. Just a few more feet, a few steps, 1 mile. Katherine held her head high and tried to catch her breath. But the mailman stared. The milkman asked if she was okay, because in 1959, it was strange to see a girl running. Girls weren't supposed to sweat. Girls weren't supposed to compete. They were too weak, too fragile for sports. That's what most people thought, but not Katherine. She thought running was magic. Pat, 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 pat. At 17, Katherine traded laps in her backyard for laps at the Lynchburg College track, where she was a student. 3 miles. One rainy afternoon, Katherine noticed the men's running coach waiting for her along the track. "Can you run a mile?" he asked. "I can run 3, Katherine scoffed. Although there was no women's running team, Lynchburg was one of the very few schools that allowed women to run in the men's races. The team needed more runners, and Katherine was eager to join. Pat, 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 pat. 4 laps around, 3 laps to go, 2 laps. 1 more. She finished her first competitive mile. One day, Katherine interviewed 2 teammates for the sports section of the school newspaper. They had just run the Boston Marathon, a race that was more than 26 miles long. Katherine's eyes shined. She had never heard of anyone running that far. Katherine began classes at Syracuse University later that fall. Like Lynchburg, there was no women's running team. Syracuse didn't allow women to compete in races. But the men's running coach invited Katherine to practice with them. Arnie Briggs, the volunteer team manager, beamed. "I've been here 20 years, and we've never had a girl before." Katherine felt welcome. Pat, 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 pat. At first, the others ran just ahead of Katherine, and she struggled to keep up. Soon, there was no one in sight. So Arnie started running with her. Day after day, month after month, they ran side by side. 5 miles, 10 miles. Arnie told lots of stories to pass the time. Most of them were about the Boston Marathon. He had run it 15 times. One winter's day, Katherine confessed to Arnie that she wanted to run it too. "Women can't do that kind of distance," he replied. "They can't run that long." "But I run 6 or even 10 miles with you every night," Katherine shot back. Arnie always told her how good she was at running. How could he doubt her? Katherine knew that 10 miles was a long way from 26, but she believed she could run any distance if she trained for it, and she wanted to train for the Boston Marathon. "If any woman can run a marathon, I believe you could," Arnie admitted, "but even you would have to prove it to me." "You're on," replied Katherine. Pat, 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 pat. Katherine ran through the bitter cold of January and February and March. 12 miles, 14 miles. Snowbanks piled high. Sidewalks disappeared. It was hard to run on the road safely. Her legs ached and blisters covered her feet. 16 miles, 18 miles. She cut triangle wedges out of her sneakers just to get them over her swollen toes. On her last training run, Katherine ran and ran and ran. 31 miles. That was almost 5 miles farther than the marathon. Katherine was ready. But Katherine had a problem. For 70 years, only men had been allowed to wear an official race number while running the Boston Marathon. Would she be accepted as a woman? Should she run without signing up? Katherine checked the rule book. The section titled "The Marathon" said nothing about the distance being only for men. The entry form said nothing about it either. After all, women weren't supposed to sweat. Women weren't supposed to compete. They were too weak, too fragile to run that far. That's what most people still thought. But not Katherine. April 19th, 1967. The day of the Boston Marathon. A record 741 runners registered for the race, including Katherine K.V. Switzer, the only woman with an official number. "Come on, runners, let's move on in." Snow gathered on the race officials' hats as they tried to corral the runners. Katherine and Arnie jogged around to keep warm before shuffling into the starting area. The runners moved closer. The crowd fell silent. The gun went off. Bang! Away Katherine ran. Pat, 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 pat. The cheers from the crowd were exhilarating. Katherine smiled. Faster runners passed by, excited to see a woman in the race. They wished her well as they continued down the course. Katherine relaxed and found her running rhythm. Pat, 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 pat. Beep, beep. Runners, move to your right. A truck filled with newspaper photographers moved through the pack. A bus carrying race officials followed behind. Runner 261 stood out from the others. Was that a girl wearing a race number? The photographers wanted pictures. The race officials wanted her out. Suddenly, a man stood in the road, blocking Katherine's way. He reached for her hand and grabbed her glove as she sidestepped past him. Who was that? Scrit, scrit. Katherine heard something behind her. It wasn't like the pat, pat, pat of sneakers. Scrit, scrit, scrit. Katherine turned to look. A different man, an angrier man, shouted, "Give me those numbers!" He swiped at the front of her shirt. Katherine struggled to break free. Arnie tried to push him away. Boom! Another runner barreled into the man and sent him flying off the course. Shaken but freed, Katherine ran as fast as her legs would take her. Pat, 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 pat. For a moment, Katherine wondered if she should quit. She still had 24 miles to go. Suddenly, finishing wasn't just about her. If she quit now, no one would believe that a woman could run a marathon. People would still say women weren't supposed to sweat. Women weren't supposed to compete. They were too weak, too fragile. They shouldn't be allowed to run. No matter what, I have to finish this race, she told Arnie. On my hands and knees if I have to. So, Katherine ran on. Pat, 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 pat. 12 miles, 14 miles, 16 miles, 18 miles. Katherine watched the women standing on the sidelines of the course. Some cheered, but many didn't. If only they knew how magical running was. If only they weren't afraid to try. They could be just like Katherine. They just didn't know it. Katherine rounded the final corner. Less than 2 blocks to go. Just a few more feet, a few steps. 26.2 miles. Katherine held her head high and tried to catch her breath. Reporters surrounded her. What made you do it, they asked. Why Boston and why wear numbers? Katherine's answer was simple. I like to run. Women deserve to run too. Author's note. It took a lot of hard work, but slowly people started to agree with Katherine. Women deserve to run too. More girls discovered the magic of running. Today, girls everywhere are no longer afraid to try. They no longer stand on the side of the course. They are just like Katherine, fearless. It's important to note that Katherine Switzer did not intentionally mislead race officials. She signed her entry from using her initials, K.V., simply because that's how she was accustomed to signing things. College papers and articles she wrote for the school newspaper. Her health form, which was required for all runners, was completed using her full name. Katherine even put on makeup and earrings for the race. Despite the actions of these two Boston Athletic Association officials, Katherine Switzer completed her historic run of the Boston Marathon in 4 hours and 20 minutes. Just days after the race, the Amateur Athletic Union expelled Katherine. Her violations including running the Boston Marathon with men and running the Boston Marathon without a chaperone. But that didn't stop Katherine from continuing to challenge the all-male dynamic of the distance running field. She went on to run more than 40 marathons. In 1974, 7 years after she first ran Boston, Katherine won the women's division of the New York City Marathon. In 1978, Katherine teamed up with Avon to organize the first Avon International Women's Marathon. It was the beginning of a successful campaign for the inclusion of the women's marathon event in the Olympic Games in Los Angeles in 1984. For her contributions to the advancement of women's distance running, she was inducted into the National Distance Running Hall of Fame in 1998 and the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2011. Katherine continues to change women's lives through the nonprofit organization 261 Fearless. United under Katherine's iconic Boston Marathon number, this community of local running clubs connects across the globe, providing opportunities for women to find their strength and self-esteem through running and walking. Through 261 Fearless, Katherine's legacy of women empowering women lives on. www.261fearless.org. To commemorate the 50th anniversary of her Boston Marathon run, Katherine ran the marathon again on April 17, 2017, alongside members of the 261 Fearless. She finished with an official time of 4 hours and 44 minutes. Afterward, Katherine's bib number was officially retired by the Boston Athletic Association. Women and the Boston Marathon. The first running of the Boston Marathon, the world's oldest annual marathon, was held in 1897. 15 runners, all men, started the race, but only 10 finished. In 1972, 5 years after Katherine Switzer's run, women were allowed to officially enter the Boston Marathon. 9 women registered and 8 finished. Katherine took 3rd place in the women's division. In 1966, 1 year before Katherine Switzer ran as the first registered female runner, Roberta Bobby Gibb completed the course unofficially after hiding behind bushes and slipping into the race. Since 2008, more than 10,000 women officially entered to run the Boston Marathon each year.